The courtroom was packed, a dense mix of murmurs and whispers barely kept at bay by the formality of the setting. The trial of Ethan Turner had captured the attention of the entire city, and today was the day it all began. Inside the modern courthouse, towering windows allowed shafts of sunlight to fall onto the gleaming wooden floors, but the air remained thick with tension. Ethan Turner sat quietly at the defendant's bench, his gaze fixed on a distant point, seemingly oblivious to the spectators staring at him. His worn-out gray suit hung loosely on his lean frame, and his hands rested motionless on the table before him. He was in his late 30s, though the lines on his face hinted at a life older than his years. His dark hair was neatly combed back, though a few rebellious strands had escaped to his forehead, adding to his unpolished appearance. His most striking feature, however, was the small silver necklace around his neck, a modest, unassuming piece of jewelry that seemed out of place on a man accused of such serious crimes. Ethan's eyes briefly met those of the presiding judge, Sarah Williams, as she entered the room. Judge Williams was a respected figure, her reputation built over decades of fair and thoughtful rulings. Her presence commanded the attention of everyone in the room, though today, she moved with an unusual hesitation. Dressed in her black judicial robes, her silver hair tied back in a tight bun, she carried the poise of someone accustomed to bearing the weight of difficult decisions. But as she glanced at Ethan's necklace, her usual composure faltered. For a fleeting second, Sarah felt her heart stop. That necklace, its simple design, the way it hung just below Ethan's collar, it was identical to the one her daughter, Emily, had worn the day she disappeared, 10 years ago. Sarah blinked rapidly, trying to steady herself, but the courtroom's atmosphere suddenly felt oppressive. Memories she had long tried to suppress flooded back into her mind, the night Emily vanished, the desperate search that followed, and the crushing void left in the wake of her daughter's absence. She gripped the edge of her bench, her knuckles white, and forced herself to look away. She couldn't afford to lose control. Not now. At the prosecutor's table, John Harper watched the scene unfold, his sharp eyes missing nothing. Harper was known for his ambition, a rising star in the city's legal world. Tall and broad-shouldered, he exuded confidence in every step, his suit perfectly tailored to match his aggressive courtroom style. Today, his objective was clear, to prove Ethan Turner guilty beyond a shadow of a doubt. As Harper prepared to deliver his opening statement, his mind was racing through the evidence, the testimonies, and the string of circumstantial clues that painted Ethan as the man responsible for a series of mysterious disappearances over the last decade. But something in Judge Williams' expression caught his attention, an uncharacteristic crack in her usually impenetrable demeanor. Interesting, he thought, filing the observation away for later use. Detective Mark Reynolds sat in the audience, arms crossed, his face unreadable. A seasoned investigator, Reynolds had been assigned to the case months ago, but something about it had struck a nerve. It wasn't just the typical job for him, something more personal had drawn him in, something buried deep in the shadows of his past. As he studied Ethan from across the room, his instincts told him there was more to this man than met the eye. Reynolds was a man who rarely let his emotions show. His sharp jawline and steely blue eyes gave him the look of someone who had seen too much in his years on the force. His graying hair added to his weathered appearance, but his movements were still precise and deliberate, revealing a mind constantly at work. As Harper stood to address the jury, the courtroom fell silent. "Ladies and gentlemen," Harper began, his voice smooth and commanding, "we are here today to seek justice for the victims who can no longer speak for themselves. The evidence you will hear over the course of this trial will show that Ethan Turner is not only guilty of the charges against him but that he has been involved in the disappearance of several individuals, whose lives were tragically cut short." Ethan shifted slightly in his seat, though his expression remained unreadable. His eyes briefly flicked toward the jury, but he quickly looked down again, as though retreating into himself. Judge Williams, trying to focus on Harper's words, found her thoughts drifting back to that necklace. Why did Ethan have it? How could something so personal, so intimately tied to her daughter, be in the possession of this man? She felt the ground slipping from beneath her as the years of grief and unanswered questions rushed back, threatening to overwhelm her carefully constructed facade. Harper's voice continued to echo through the courtroom, but for Sarah, it became a distant hum. She stared at Ethan, and for the first time in a decade, hope stirred inside her, a dangerous, flickering hope that maybe, just maybe, this trial would bring answers to the mystery that had haunted her for so long. As the exposition closed, the courtroom braced for what would come next. Each person in the room, Ethan, Judge Williams, Prosecutor Harper, and Detective Reynolds, was on the edge of a revelation, one that would change all their lives. Ethan Turner, a quiet man in his late 30s, sitting as the defendant in a high-profile trial. Accused of a crime connected to a mysterious disappearance, he remains enigmatic, with a history that is still unraveling. His worn-out appearance and the silver necklace he wears hint at deeper secrets. Judge Sarah Williams, a respected and fair judge, known for her decades of experience. However, the sight of Ethan's necklace deeply unsettles her, as it is identical to the one her missing daughter, Emily, wore 10 years ago. Sarah is torn between her duty as a judge and her personal connection to the case. Prosecutor John Harper, an ambitious and determined prosecutor, eager to prove Ethan's guilt. He is sharp, observant, and intent on climbing the ranks of the legal world, seeing this case as an opportunity to make a name for himself. Detective Mark Reynolds, a seasoned investigator with a personal interest in the case. He has a quiet, calculating demeanor, and his past experiences drive him to uncover hidden truths, no matter where they may lead. As Judge Sarah Williams settled into her seat behind the elevated bench, the weight of the room pressed down on her. She shuffled the case files in front of her, trying to focus, but her mind kept circling back to that necklace. The courtroom, filled with a steady hum of anticipation, felt smaller and tighter than usual. Harper's voice was sharp and deliberate as he began his opening statement, laying out the details of the case against Ethan Turner. But Sarah could barely hear him. Her gaze kept flicking to Ethan's neck, where that simple silver necklace rested. The same one that had vanished with Emily all those years ago. The sight of it gripped her in a way she hadn't anticipated, reigniting pain and confusion she thought she had buried long ago. Harper's words faded into the background as memories flashed before her eyes, Emily's laughter on the morning she disappeared, her bright smile, and the necklace, Emily's favorite piece of jewelry, a gift from Sarah herself on her 16th birthday. It had been a simple but meaningful gesture, something that bonded them, a symbol of their once close relationship. After Emily vanished, that necklace became a symbol of Sarah's failure. How could Ethan Turner, this man she had never seen before, be wearing it now? Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she pressed them against the cool wood of the bench, trying to steady herself. She forced her focus back on Harper, but her thoughts continued to spiral. Was this some cruel coincidence? Or had Ethan Turner been connected to her daughter's disappearance all along? The room around her blurred as Emily's face appeared vividly in her mind. Her daughter's eyes, the way they used to shine with hope and ambition, now haunted Sarah. She felt a pang of guilt for losing sight of that memory, for allowing the years to wash over the case without closure. Ethan shifted slightly in his seat, and Sarah's gaze snapped to him again. There was something unnerving about his calm demeanor, about the way he sat there, seemingly detached from the chaos unfolding around him. His fingers absently brushed against the necklace, a casual movement, but to Sarah, it felt like a personal taunt. Her pulse quickened as 1,000 questions surged through her mind. How did he get it? Why was he wearing it? Harper, finishing his opening remarks, took a step back from the jury, his eyes scanning the room before resting on Ethan. His voice was filled with conviction, his confidence unwavering. This man, Harper said, pointing toward the defendant, is the common thread in a series of disappearances. We will show, through evidence and testimony, that Ethan Turner is not only responsible for these heinous crimes but that his actions have left families like yours devastated. Sarah's chest tightened as the prosecutor's words seemed to strike a deeper chord within her. Devastated families. Harper didn't know how true his words were for her, how her family had been ripped apart, how her husband had left her when the weight of Emily's disappearance became too much to bear. David had accused Sarah of becoming obsessed with finding their daughter, and maybe he had been right. But how could she not be? Sarah blinked rapidly, trying to dispel the fog of memories that clouded her mind. She needed to stay objective, to maintain her professionalism. But how could she, when the case before her now threatened to unravel the fragile life she had rebuilt? Every word Harper spoke, every fact presented, seemed to tug at the frayed edges of her emotions. She had to know how that necklace ended up in Ethan's possession. As Harper concluded his statement, Sarah straightened in her seat, gripping her gavel tightly. "Does the defense have anything to add at this time?" she asked, her voice betraying none of the storm brewing inside her. Ethan's attorney, a lanky man named Greg Summers, stood and adjusted his glasses. "We have nothing to add at this point, Your Honor, except to remind the jury that Mr. Turner maintains his innocence. We will provide our defense as the trial unfolds." Summers sat back down, and Sarah nodded curtly. Her hands itched to reach for the necklace herself, to examine it, to confront Ethan directly. But she couldn't. Not yet. With a sharp rap of the gavel, she announced, "We'll begin testimony after a short recess." The courtroom stirred as people began to rise, but Sarah remained seated, her eyes fixed on Ethan as the bailiff led him from the room. He turned his head slightly as he passed by the bench, and for a brief moment, their eyes met. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she searched his face for any sign of recognition, any indication that he knew more than he was letting on. But Ethan's expression remained inscrutable. Alone in her chambers, Sarah sank into her chair, feeling the full weight of the moment pressing down on her. The necklace was no coincidence, she was sure of it. Her mind raced through the possibilities, each one more disturbing than the last. What if Ethan had been involved in Emily's disappearance? What if he knew what had happened to her? She rubbed her temples, the tension building into a dull throb behind her eyes. "I have to stay calm," she told herself. "I can't let this distract me from the case." But how could she separate the judge from the mother? How could she sit on this bench and pass judgment on a man who might hold the answers to the deepest, most painful mystery of her life? A knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. Detective Mark Reynolds stepped inside, his usual stoic expression in place. He took a seat across from her, folding his hands neatly in his lap. "Sarah," he began, his tone formal but laced with concern, "I've been looking into the case, and I came across something troubling." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Go on." Reynolds hesitated for a moment, as if choosing his words carefully. "I started digging deeper into Ethan Turner's past, trying to trace the origin of that necklace. I'm not sure if you've noticed, but it looks familiar." Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. She leaned forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, I've noticed." Reynolds nodded, his expression grim. "I've uncovered some unsettling connections between Ethan and several unsolved missing persons cases. This isn't just about one disappearance, there's a pattern. People connected to Ethan have been vanishing for years. And that necklace, it could be the key to unraveling it all." Sarah's mind raced, her thoughts spiraling. The idea that Ethan could be part of something bigger than just Emily's disappearance sent a chill down her spine. A conspiracy, a network of missing persons, could it really be true? "Mark," she whispered, her voice trembling, "I think that necklace belonged to my daughter." Reynolds' eyes widened in shock. "Emily?" Sarah nodded, the pain evident in her voice. "She was wearing it the day she disappeared." The detective sat back, absorbing the weight of her words. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, but the picture they were forming was darker than either of them had imagined. "We need to find out how Ethan got that necklace," Sarah said, her voice hardening with resolve. "And we need to find out fast." The inciting incident had taken hold, setting off a chain of events that none of them could stop. Sarah, now entangled in the case in ways she could never have predicted, knew that her quest for justice had just become personal. The courtroom awaited her return, but so did the unanswered questions, each one more dangerous than the last. And in the center of it all stood Ethan Turner, a man who held more secrets than anyone could yet understand. The next morning, the courtroom buzzed with an undercurrent of anticipation as the trial resumed. Judge Sarah Williams sat at the bench, her face a mask of composure, though inside she was anything but calm. She had spent most of the previous night replaying the events of the trial's opening day in her mind: Ethan's necklace, her conversation with Detective Reynolds, and the flood of memories that wouldn't leave her alone. Ethan Turner sat at the defendant's table, his fingers still absently brushing the necklace that now occupied Sarah's every waking thought. His lawyer, Greg Summers, quietly shuffled through his papers, preparing for what would undoubtedly be a day full of revelations. The first witness was called to the stand, Detective Mark Reynolds. As he rose from his seat and made his way to the witness box, Sarah's pulse quickened. Reynolds had been working tirelessly since their conversation the day before, and Sarah knew that what he had uncovered could change everything. Harper stood confidently, pacing before the jury. "Detective Reynolds, thank you for your time today. Please tell the court about your investigation into the disappearance of several individuals and how it relates to the defendant, Ethan Turner." Reynolds cleared his throat and leaned forward, his voice steady and clear. "Over the past several months, I have been investigating the case of Ethan Turner. Initially, Mr. Turner was linked to the disappearance of one individual, but upon further investigation, I discovered a disturbing pattern. Multiple people who were connected to Turner, either personally or through work, have gone missing under suspicious circumstances. In each case, there were no signs of foul play, but the disappearances followed a similar pattern, individuals suddenly vanishing without a trace." The jurors shifted in their seats, clearly intrigued. Harper stepped closer to Reynolds, his voice taking on a sharper edge. "And what, if anything, ties these cases together?" Reynolds took a breath, his gaze briefly flickering to Ethan before continuing. "The key link is Ethan Turner himself. He has been associated with each of the missing persons in some way, whether through personal relationships or by proximity to their last known whereabouts." Sarah's stomach churned as she listened. The implications were terrifying. Was Ethan Turner truly involved in multiple disappearances, or was he merely a victim of circumstance? Either way, the deeper this trial went, the more personal it became for her. Harper paced the room again. "And detective, in your investigation, did you come across any physical evidence that links Ethan Turner to these disappearances?" Reynolds hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Yes. I began to focus on a specific item of interest, the necklace Mr. Turner has been wearing. It's been brought to my attention that this necklace matches the description of one that belonged to Judge Williams' daughter, Emily, who disappeared 10 years ago." A murmur spread through the courtroom like wildfire. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, and for a moment, the room seemed to blur. She quickly regained control, her face remaining impassive, but inside, her emotions were a storm. Harper turned to face the jury, his voice rising with intensity. "Detective Reynolds, are you suggesting that the necklace around the defendant's neck could be a direct link to a missing person from a decade ago?" Reynolds nodded solemnly. "Yes, I am. And not just any missing person, Judge Williams' own daughter." The air in the courtroom seemed to freeze. Sarah's fingers tightened around the edge of her bench, and for the first time in years, she felt utterly exposed. The case was spiraling in ways she could never have anticipated. This wasn't just about justice for the victims. This was about Emily. Harper turned to Ethan, his expression fierce. "Mr. Turner, you've been silent about the origins of that necklace. Can you now explain to the court where it came from?" Ethan shifted uncomfortably in his seat but remained silent. His lawyer, Greg Summers, quickly rose to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. The defense is under no obligation to explain anything at this point." Sarah's mind was racing, but she maintained her professional composure. "Sustained. The defense is correct, Mr. Harper. Proceed." Harper's face tightened, but he nodded and returned his focus to Reynolds. "Detective, is there any indication that Ethan Turner was directly involved in Emily Williams' disappearance?" Reynolds hesitated again, his expression unreadable. "At this point, we have no direct evidence linking Ethan Turner to Emily's disappearance, but the circumstances surrounding the necklace are suspicious, to say the least." Sarah swallowed hard. The tension in the room was palpable, and she knew that every eye in the room was now on her. But she couldn't let her personal connection to the case interfere. She had to remain impartial. That was her duty. As Reynolds stepped down from the stand, the courtroom shifted once more. The prosecution had made its move, and now the defense would have its chance to respond. Later that afternoon, Detective Reynolds sat at his desk in the police station, poring over the details of Ethan Turner's past. He had spent the last 24 hours digging deeper into Turner's background, and what he had uncovered was unsettling. Several people close to Ethan had disappeared over the years, all under eerily similar circumstances. And yet, there was nothing concrete linking Ethan to the crimes. No bodies, no direct evidence. Only whispers and coincidences. Reynolds rubbed his temples, feeling the exhaustion creeping in. His gut told him that Ethan was involved in something much larger than a single disappearance, something far darker. But without solid proof, he was stuck. Just as he was about to call it a night, his phone buzzed. It was a text from a confidential informant, someone who had worked with law enforcement in the past but preferred to remain anonymous. "Meet me tonight. I have information on Turner. It's bigger than you think. Don't come alone." Reynolds felt a shiver run down his spine. This wasn't the first time he had received cryptic messages from this source, and they had always led to important breakthroughs. If this informant had something on Turner, Reynolds knew he couldn't ignore it. Back in her chambers, Sarah sat alone, her mind whirling. The necklace, the testimonies, the growing suspicion surrounding Ethan, it was all too much. She had spent so many years searching for answers about Emily, and now those answers seemed tantalizingly close. But the thought terrified her. What if Ethan had been involved all along? What if she had been sitting in judgment of the very man who knew where her daughter was? She glanced at a photograph of Emily that sat on her desk, her daughter's bright eyes looking back at her, full of life and hope. "I won't stop," Sarah thought, her resolve hardening. "I won't stop until I know the truth." Her phone rang, startling her out of her thoughts. It was Detective Reynolds. "Sarah, I've got a lead," he said, his voice low and urgent. "It's about Ethan. I don't have all the details yet, but I'm meeting a source tonight. They claim to have information that could break the case wide open." Sarah felt her heart skip a beat. "Mark, be careful. If this is connected to Emily." "I know," Reynolds interrupted gently. "I'll keep you updated. But this feels big." As the call ended, Sarah sat in silence, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. The case was moving faster than she had anticipated, and the lines between her role as a judge and as a mother were becoming increasingly blurred. She knew she needed to stay strong, to keep her emotions in check. But with each new revelation, that was becoming harder and harder. As night fell over the city, the rising tension in the case mirrored the darkening sky. The trial was far from over, and the truth, whatever it may be, was still just out of reach. But one thing was certain, whatever happened next would change everything. Rising action, Detective Reynolds begins to dig deeper into Ethan Turner's past, uncovering unsettling links between Ethan and several unsolved disappearances. Meanwhile, Sarah struggles to maintain her professionalism as the evidence surrounding the necklace points more and more toward her daughter's disappearance. The tension mounts as Detective Reynolds receives a cryptic lead, setting the stage for the complications that will soon arise. That night, the city streets were cloaked in darkness, only dimly lit by the occasional street lamp. Detective Mark Reynolds drove toward the agreed meeting point, his fingers drumming against the steering wheel in nervous anticipation. The informant had chosen an out-of-the-way location, a dilapidated warehouse on the outskirts of the city. Reynolds had been in similar situations before, but this time felt different. The weight of the case, the personal connection to Judge Williams, and the mounting pressure to find answers added a layer of tension he couldn't shake. He parked his car a block away and approached the warehouse cautiously. The towering structure loomed above him, its windows broken and covered in grime. The silence was eerie, broken only by the occasional rustle of the wind. Reynolds checked his phone one last time. A single message from his informant, inside. Come alone. He stepped through the rusty door and into the cavernous space. The dim light from his flashlight barely penetrated the shadows, and the air was thick with the smell of dust and decay. As he moved deeper into the warehouse, his footsteps echoed off the walls, each step heightening the tension. Then, he saw a figure standing in the shadows at the far end of the room. The informant. "You're late," the voice said, calm but laced with impatience. Reynolds stopped a few feet away, keeping his flashlight low. "Traffic," he replied coolly. "You said you had information about Ethan Turner." "Something bigger." "Let's hear it." The informant hesitated for a moment before stepping closer. "Turner isn't just a man caught up in these disappearances," the informant said quietly. "He's a part of something much larger, a syndicate called the Remnants. They've been involved in human trafficking and illegal operations for years, covering their tracks and using people like Turner as pawns. The necklace, the disappearances, he's just one piece of a much bigger puzzle." Reynolds' blood ran cold. Human trafficking? The words hit him hard. This was no longer just about Emily Williams or a string of disappearances. This was about an entire underground operation, hidden from the public eye. The implications were staggering. "You're saying Ethan's working with this group?" Reynolds pressed. "What exactly is his role?" The informant shook their head. "Not working with them. He's more like a middleman, someone who knows too much. That's why people around him keep disappearing. The Remnants clean up their messes, and they're ruthless about it. They leave no loose ends." Reynolds clenched his jaw, the pieces of the puzzle beginning to fall into place. The missing persons, the necklace, Ethan's mysterious connection to it all, this wasn't just about one man. This was a syndicate pulling the strings from the shadows. "And what about Emily Williams?" Reynolds asked, his voice low. "What happened to her?" The informant hesitated, glancing around as if afraid of being overheard. "She was involved, too. Not willingly, at first. But she got close to someone connected to the Remnants. They helped her disappear. Turner knows more than he's saying, but he's scared. He's in deep." The revelation hit Reynolds like a punch to the gut. Emily hadn't just disappeared, she had been hidden, protected by the very people responsible for so much suffering. And Ethan Turner, whether he was complicit or not, had kept that secret for years. "Why didn't he come forward?" Reynolds asked, his voice thick with frustration. "Why keep this secret if he's not guilty?" The informant let out a bitter laugh. "You don't understand how the Remnants work. They have influence everywhere, law enforcement, government, even the courts. If Turner had spoken up, he would have been dead before he finished his sentence. The only reason he's still alive is because he's kept his mouth shut." Reynolds felt a chill run down his spine. The scale of the conspiracy was overwhelming. If the Remnants truly had their hooks in so many powerful places, bringing them down would be nearly impossible. But he couldn't back down now. Too much was at stake. "Why are you telling me this?" Reynolds asked, narrowing his eyes. "Why now?" The informant took a step back, their voice lowering. "Because things are starting to unravel. Turner's on trial, and the Remnants are nervous. If you want to bring them down, you need to move fast. But be careful. They won't hesitate to eliminate anyone who gets too close." With that, the informant disappeared into the shadows, leaving Reynolds alone in the vast, empty space. His mind raced as he processed everything he had just learned. The Remnants. Human trafficking. Emily's disappearance. Ethan Turner. It was all connected, and the stakes were higher than he had ever imagined. Reynolds turned and left the warehouse, his determination solidified. He knew he had to confront Ethan and find a way to get him to talk. Time was running out. Back at the courthouse, Sarah sat at her desk, the necklace still on her mind. Her hands shook slightly as she reviewed the case files, her emotions threatening to break through the surface. She couldn't help but feel that this trial was leading her closer to the truth, closer to finding out what had really happened to Emily. The door to her chambers opened, and Prosecutor Harper entered, his face tense. "Judge Williams," he began, his voice low, "we need to talk." Sarah looked up, her heart sinking. She could tell from his expression that whatever he had to say wasn't good. "What is it?" Harper hesitated before speaking. "I just received word that there have been some complications with our investigation into Turner. It seems we're not the only ones interested in this case. There are forces at play that are beyond what we initially thought. Corruption, cover-ups, it's deeper than we imagined." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed was a blow. "How deep does it go?" Harper grimaced. "Deep enough that some of our key witnesses are suddenly unavailable. The remnants, the group we believe Turner is connected to, has influence in places we didn't anticipate. We may have a hard time bringing this case to a close." Sarah stood up, her hands trembling with a mix of anger and fear. "So, what are you saying? That we let Turner walk? That we let these people get away with it?" Harper shook his head. "No, we fight. But we have to be smart about it. The remnants are dangerous, and if we push too hard, we could end up doing more harm than good." Sarah's mind whirled. The trial was at a critical point, and now she was faced with the possibility that the truth might be buried, that justice for Emily and all the other victims might slip through her fingers. But she wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. The next day in court, the tension was palpable. Ethan sat at the defense table, his face drawn and tired. He had remained silent throughout the proceedings, but now, with the walls closing in around him, there was a shift in his demeanor, something between fear and resignation. Detective Reynolds took the stand once again, this time armed with the knowledge he had gained from the informant. He testified about the deeper connections he had uncovered, about the network of corruption and the possibility that Ethan Turner was a pawn in a much larger game. Harper pressed Reynolds on the details, asking him to explain the magnitude of the remnants' reach. "Detective Reynolds, are you suggesting that this trial is being influenced by an underground syndicate?" Reynolds nodded. "Yes. The remnants are involved in human trafficking, and they have people in high places. Ethan Turner may not be the mastermind, but he knows more than he's letting on. The evidence points to a conspiracy that goes far beyond this courtroom." The courtroom was silent, the weight of Reynolds' words settling over the jurors and spectators like a heavy fog. Sarah, from the bench, could feel the enormity of the situation pressing down on her. She glanced at Ethan, who was staring at the floor, his shoulders slumped in defeat. For the first time, Sarah began to see Ethan not as a monster, but as a man caught in something much larger than himself. But that didn't absolve him of the secrets he had kept, and she needed answers. As the trial moved forward, the complications only deepened, pulling everyone involved further into a web of danger, deception, and uncertainty. The truth was out there, but it was buried beneath layers of lies and fear, and Sarah knew that if they were going to find it, they would need to confront not just Ethan Turner, but the forces that had been controlling him for so long. The case was no longer just about guilt or innocence, it was about survival. Complications. Reynolds uncovers a link between Ethan Turner and a criminal syndicate known as the Remnants, involved in human trafficking. The discovery reveals a larger conspiracy, with corruption running deep in the city's institutions. The trial becomes more dangerous, and Sarah grapples with her personal connection to the case. Ethan, while not directly responsible, knows more than he's letting on, and time is running out to expose the truth. The courtroom felt even more oppressive as the trial reached its boiling point. Tensions were running high, not just among the attorneys and the defendant, but throughout the entire city. The public had latched onto every twist and turn in the case, captivated by the unfolding drama. But inside the courthouse, a darker truth was beginning to emerge, and Sarah Williams could feel it creeping closer with each passing moment. Ethan Turner sat at the defense table, his head hung low, his fingers nervously brushing the necklace around his neck. His once stoic demeanor had begun to crack under the weight of what had been revealed. The ties to the Remnants, the mysterious disappearances, and the corruption reaching into law enforcement and the justice system, it was all spiraling out of control. Prosecutor Harper stood in front of the jury, his voice steady but filled with urgency. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we have heard testimony that goes beyond the scope of this single trial. We have uncovered evidence of a criminal syndicate, one that has been operating in the shadows, pulling strings and manipulating events. Ethan Turner is not just a man on trial for a single crime, he is a key piece of a much larger puzzle. We believe that he knows far more about the fate of the missing individuals than he has admitted. Ethan's lawyer, Greg Summers, rose to his feet, his face flushed with frustration. Objection, Your Honor. The prosecution is overreaching. There has been no direct evidence linking Mr. Turner to the syndicate known as the Remnants. This is pure speculation. Judge Sarah Williams listened to the argument, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew that Summers was right, the evidence was circumstantial, a web of tenuous connections that painted a grim picture but didn't offer definitive proof. But deep down, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that Ethan was hiding something. He had to be. The necklace, the disappearances, Emily, it was all connected. She just didn't know how. Objection sustained, Sarah said, her voice steady, though inside she was a maelstrom of conflicting emotions. Mr. Harper, please stick to the evidence at hand. Harper nodded, but his eyes gleamed with determination. Of course, Your Honor. He turned back to the jury, pacing slowly. The evidence we've presented suggests that Mr. Turner has been involved with the Remnants in some capacity, and that the necklace he wears, identical to one belonging to Judge Williams' missing daughter, points to a deeper, more sinister connection. Ethan shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his hand once again reaching for the necklace. He looked as though he might speak, but then thought better of it. Summers leaned toward him, whispering urgently, but Ethan shook his head. Suddenly, the doors at the back of the courtroom burst open, and gasps echoed through the room. Sarah's heart stopped as she saw her daughter, Emily Williams, standing in the doorway. She looked older, thinner, her face drawn and pale, but there was no mistaking her. Sarah's eyes locked onto the necklace around Emily's neck. It was the same one she had seen on Ethan, identical in every way. The room went deathly silent. Emily hesitated for a moment before walking down the aisle, her footsteps echoing in the stillness. Her appearance was like a shockwave, rippling through everyone present. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she watched her daughter, alive, after all these years. The emotions she had buried for so long surged forward, relief, confusion, anger, but mostly, an overwhelming need to understand what had happened. Ethan's head snapped up, his face a mask of disbelief. He looked at Emily with a mixture of guilt and fear, as if her presence confirmed everything he had been hiding. Emily reached the witness stand, her hands trembling slightly as she sat down. The courtroom remained frozen, every eye on her, every breath held in anticipation. Judge Williams struggled to maintain her composure. Emily, she whispered, barely able to speak. Is it really you? Emily looked up, her eyes meeting her mother's for the first time in 10 years. Yes, Mom, she said softly, her voice hoarse. It's me. Sarah's hands gripped the bench, her knuckles white. She wanted to run to her daughter, to hold her, but she couldn't. Not yet. The trial wasn't over, and there were still too many unanswered questions. Harper, his usual confidence shaken by Emily's sudden appearance, cleared his throat and approached the stand. Emily, he began carefully, can you explain to the court where you have been for the past 10 years? Emily hesitated, glancing briefly at Ethan before answering. I left on my own. I needed to get away. The courtroom erupted in whispers, but Sarah's mind was reeling. She left on her own? That couldn't be true. Emily had been a loving, bright young woman. She wouldn't have just disappeared like that. Why? Harper asked, leaning closer. Why did you leave? And what connection do you have to Ethan Turner and the Remnants? Emily swallowed hard, her eyes flickering with fear. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I was in a relationship with someone connected to the Remnants. I thought I could escape, start a new life, but I was wrong. They helped me disappear, but in exchange, I had to stay quiet. I had to stay hidden. Sarah's heart shattered as Emily spoke. The pieces of the puzzle were finally coming together, but the picture they painted was far worse than she could have imagined. Her daughter had been tangled in a criminal web for years, trapped by people who would stop at nothing to keep their secrets safe. And Ethan Turner? Harper pressed. What role did he play in all of this? Emily glanced at Ethan, her expression softening. Ethan, he knew about the remnants, but he wasn't involved in the crimes. He helped me. He was the only one who knew where I was. He kept my secret, even though he knew it could destroy him. The courtroom fell into stunned silence. Sarah's mind raced as she tried to process what Emily was saying. Ethan wasn't guilty, at least not in the way they had all thought. He had kept Emily's secret, yes, but at what cost? And why had he stayed silent for so long? Summers rose from his seat, clearly seeing an opportunity to turn the case around. Your Honor, I believe my client's innocence has just been established. Mr. Turner was not involved in any criminal activity, he was merely trying to protect Ms. Williams. I move for immediate dismissal of all charges. Harper frowned, clearly unsettled by the sudden turn of events. Your Honor, we still have reason to believe Mr. Turner is withholding information. The remnants are still out there, and we need to understand the full extent of his knowledge. Sarah sat frozen, torn between her duty as a judge and her instincts as a mother. She had waited 10 long years for this moment, but the answers she had finally received were more complicated than she could have imagined. Ethan wasn't the monster she had thought him to be, but that didn't make him innocent. He had held on to a truth that could have spared her years of agony, all in the name of protecting her daughter. Summoning all her strength, Sarah spoke, her voice steady but filled with emotion. The court will take a brief recess to consider the motion. The gavel echoed through the room, and Sarah stood, her eyes locking with Emily's one more time before she left the bench. The courtroom erupted in murmurs as Sarah walked back to her chambers, her emotions raw and bleeding. In the hallway, Sarah stood alone, her hands trembling as she leaned against the wall. Emily had returned, but the reunion was nothing like she had imagined. Her daughter had been part of a nightmare, one that was still far from over. The remnants were still out there, still pulling the strings. And Ethan Turner, he had been both protector and deceiver, trapped in a moral gray area that Sarah struggled to comprehend. As she stood there, the door to the courtroom creaked open, and Emily stepped out. For a moment, mother and daughter stood in silence, the weight of 10 years of separation hanging between them. I'm sorry, Mom, Emily whispered, her voice breaking. I didn't know how else to survive. Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes, but she fought them back. We'll figure it out, she said softly. We'll figure it out together. The truth had been revealed, but the consequences were only beginning. The remnants were still out there, and Sarah knew that this fight was far from over. But for now, she had her daughter back, and that was enough to give her the strength to face whatever came next. Climax, Emily's unexpected return to the courtroom reveals shocking truths. She had disappeared willingly, with the help of the remnants, to escape her life. Ethan Turner, though not directly involved in the criminal syndicate, had kept her secret for years. The courtroom is thrown into chaos as Emily's testimony clears Ethan of the most severe accusations, though the true danger, the reach of the remnants, remains looming. Sarah is forced to confront the truth about her daughter's disappearance, while the case against the syndicate grows ever more complicated. The courtroom felt suffocating as the trial resumed after the recess. Judge Sarah Williams sat in her chambers, trying to calm the storm inside her. Emily was back. Alive. But the weight of her daughter's choices, her involvement with the remnants, and Ethan's silence weighed heavily on Sarah's heart. It wasn't the joyous reunion she had imagined for so many years. When Sarah returned to the bench, the atmosphere was tense. Ethan Turner sat quietly, a man now more vulnerable than ever. His lawyer, Greg Summers, had a glimmer of hope in his eyes after Emily's testimony. But the prosecution wasn't ready to let Ethan off the hook entirely. Prosecutor John Harper still believed Ethan was hiding vital information that could bring down the remnants, a criminal syndicate that had so far eluded justice. Harper stood and addressed the court, his voice firm. Your Honor, while Ms. Williams' testimony sheds new light on the circumstances, we cannot ignore the fact that Ethan Turner has remained silent for years. He withheld critical information about Emily's whereabouts, and that alone has caused irreparable harm. Furthermore, the remnants are still out there, and Turner may hold the key to dismantling this criminal network. Summers quickly countered, his voice rising with confidence. Your Honor, my client's only crime was protecting a vulnerable young woman, one who sought to escape a dangerous life. Mr. Turner did not participate in any criminal activities, nor was he part of the remnants. The charges against him should be dismissed. Sarah listened, her mind racing. She had been trained to remain impartial, but how could she, when her own daughter was at the heart of this case? The lines between her duty as a judge and her role as a mother had blurred beyond recognition. She needed to make a decision, not just for the trial, but for her own peace of mind. Turning to Ethan, Sarah spoke softly but with authority. Mr. Turner, you've heard the arguments presented here today. You've remained silent throughout most of this trial, but now, I'm giving you the chance to speak. Do you have anything to say regarding the charges or the testimony we've just heard? Ethan shifted uncomfortably in his seat. For the first time since the trial began, he looked directly at Sarah, his eyes filled with guilt and remorse. His hands trembled slightly as they rested on the table in front of him. I'm sorry, he began, his voice hoarse and unsteady. I never wanted things to go this far. I never wanted anyone to get hurt. I was just trying to help Emily. She was scared, and she didn't trust anyone. I thought I was protecting her by keeping her secret. Sarah's heart tightened as Ethan spoke. His words were filled with regret, but they also exposed the weight of the burden he had carried all these years. But you had to know, Sarah pressed, her voice cracking just slightly, that by keeping her secret, you were hurting others. You let families like mine suffer, wondering what had happened to their loved ones. Ethan lowered his gaze, unable to meet her eyes. I know. And I hate myself for it. But I was scared. The remnants, they're dangerous. I didn't think I could stop them. I still don't. A heavy silence fell over the courtroom as Ethan's words lingered in the air. Harper stepped forward, his expression hard. Mr. Turner, if you truly want to make amends, now is the time to come forward with everything you know about the remnants. We have an opportunity to bring them down, but we need your help. Tell us what you know. Ethan hesitated, his body tense. He glanced at Emily, who was sitting in the audience, her face pale and filled with worry. She gave him a slight nod, urging him to speak. It was clear that she no longer wanted to live in the shadows of her past. After a long, agonizing pause, Ethan finally spoke. Okay, he said quietly, his voice trembling. I'll tell you everything. The next few hours were a whirlwind of revelations. Ethan recounted his involvement with the remnants, explaining how he had first encountered them through a friend, who had introduced him to people in their network. He had never been a willing participant, but once he realized how deep their corruption ran, it was too late. He had seen people disappear, had watched as lives were ruined, but he hadn't known how to escape. They control everything, Ethan said, his voice hollow. They have people in the police force, the courts, even city government. Anyone who gets too close to exposing them ends up gone. Ethan revealed that the necklace, which had been Emily's, was given to him by someone high up in the remnants, as a way to keep him in line. It was meant to remind him of the consequences of disobedience. If he didn't play along, Emily would be found, and worse, she would be silenced permanently. As Ethan's testimony continued, the scope of the remnants' influence became horrifyingly clear. They had orchestrated countless disappearances, covered up their tracks with precision, and held sway over people who should have been seeking justice. They were, in Ethan's words, untouchable. By the end of the day, the courtroom was in a state of shock. Ethan's testimony had painted a picture of a syndicate that was far more powerful and dangerous than anyone had realized. It was clear now that Ethan had been more of a pawn than a perpetrator, caught in the clutches of a group far beyond his control. As the trial came to a close, Judge Williams felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her. Ethan's revelations had shattered the case wide open, but there was still so much left unresolved. The remnants were still out there, still lurking in the shadows, and Sarah knew that bringing them to justice would be no easy feat. But for now, she had a decision to make. She rose from the bench, her hands steady on the gavel. The court has heard the testimony, and we have seen the evidence. While it is clear that Mr. Turner's actions have caused harm, it is also clear that he was acting out of fear, and that he was caught up in a situation far beyond his control. She paused, taking a breath. Mr. Turner, while I cannot condone your silence, I recognize that you are not the mastermind behind these crimes. You have cooperated with this court in exposing the remnants, and that cooperation will be taken into account. However, the law demands accountability. Sarah's voice softened as she turned to face Ethan directly. I sentence you to time served, with the understanding that you will continue to assist law enforcement in their investigation into the remnants. This trial is over, but the fight for justice is far from finished. The gavel came down with a resounding crack, and the room seemed to exhale all at once. After the trial, Sarah sat in her chambers, the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on her. She had seen justice done, but the victory felt hollow. The remnants were still out there, still manipulating the lives of countless people. But Sarah knew she couldn't fight this battle alone. A soft knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. Emily stepped inside, her face filled with uncertainty. Mom, Emily said quietly, her voice trembling. I know I messed up. I know I hurt you. But I'm ready to make things right. I want to help take them down. Sarah stood, crossing the room to embrace her daughter for the first time in years. Tears filled her eyes as she held Emily close, the pain and anger finally giving way to a glimmer of hope. We'll do it together, Sarah whispered, her voice filled with determination. We'll take them down. For you, for me, and for everyone they've hurt. Following action, Ethan finally reveals the full extent of the remnants' power and influence, offering crucial information to bring the criminal syndicate down. The courtroom is shaken by the revelations, and while Ethan is sentenced, it is clear that he was more of a victim than a villain. Sarah, now reunited with Emily, prepares for the next battle, dismantling the remnants and seeking justice for all those whose lives have been destroyed by the syndicate. The case may be over, but the fight is just beginning. The courthouse was quieter now, the frenzy of the trial slowly fading into memory. Ethan Turner had been escorted out of the courtroom, his fate no longer uncertain. Though he had avoided a lengthy prison sentence, his role in the fight against the remnants was far from over. His cooperation with law enforcement was now vital, as they sought to dismantle the powerful criminal syndicate that had eluded justice for years. Judge Sarah Williams sat in her chambers, the weight of the trial's conclusion still fresh on her mind. The decision she had made was just, but it hadn't been easy. The lines between right and wrong had blurred so many times throughout the trial, and the revelations about her daughter, Emily, had made everything infinitely more complicated. Emily stood in front of her now, her hands folded nervously in front of her. She looked so different from the girl Sarah had once known. The bright, hopeful teenager she had lost 10 years ago was now a young woman who had lived through unspeakable experiences. The remnants had kept her hidden, made her a pawn in their dark game, and though she had survived, she carried the scars of that life. Mom, Emily said softly, breaking the silence. I'm sorry. I never wanted to hurt you. I thought disappearing was the only way I could escape, but I was wrong. Sarah looked up at her daughter, her heart aching with a mix of sadness and relief. I don't blame you, Emily. You were doing what you thought was right, what you thought you had to do. I just wish I could have been there for you. Emily's eyes filled with tears. I was so scared, Mom. The remnants had their claws in everything. If I had stayed, they would have destroyed us both. Sarah stood up, crossing the room to embrace her daughter once again. The warmth of the hug, the familiarity of holding Emily close after all these years, brought Sarah a sense of comfort she hadn't felt in a long time. We're going to get through this, she whispered. Together. Emily nodded, her tears soaking into Sarah's shoulder. I don't know how to make things right, but I want to help take them down. The remnants can't keep doing this to people. Sarah pulled back slightly, looking into Emily's eyes. We will, she said firmly. We'll take them down, but we have to be careful. The remnants are dangerous, and they won't go down without a fight. But we're not alone. Detective Reynolds and the rest of the team are working on it. We'll find a way. Meanwhile, Detective Mark Reynolds sat in his office, a stack of papers spread out before him. Ethan's testimony had given him valuable insight into the remnants, but it wasn't enough to bring them down entirely. The syndicate's roots ran deep, and the corruption they had sown throughout the city meant that every step forward had to be taken carefully. Reynolds had been in law enforcement long enough to know that cases like this didn't get solved overnight. But something about this one was different. This wasn't just another investigation, this was personal. He had come too close to the darkness that the remnants had created, and he wasn't willing to let it continue. As he sifted through the documents, Reynolds' phone buzzed on his desk. He picked it up and saw a text from Sarah, "We're ready to help. Whatever you need, Emily and I are in." Reynolds leaned back in his chair, a sense of determination settling over him. With Emily's first-hand knowledge of the remnants and Ethan's cooperation, they finally had a real shot at dismantling the syndicate. But it wouldn't be easy. The remnants had been operating in the shadows for too long, and bringing them into the light would take time, patience, and more than a little courage. Reynolds texted back, "We'll take them down. Together." A week later, Sarah and Emily stood side by side, looking out over the city from Sarah's apartment window. The skyline was peaceful, bathed in the warm glow of the setting sun. But beneath the surface, the city was still teeming with secrets. The remnants were still out there, still trying to protect their interests, and Sarah knew that their fight was far from over. "You know," Emily said quietly, "there was a time when I thought I'd never see this again. The city, the people. I thought I'd be hiding forever." Sarah glanced at her daughter, her heart swelling with pride. Emily had been through hell and back, but she was still standing. And now, they had each other again. "You don't have to hide anymore," Sarah said softly. "You're safe now. And we're going to make sure that no one else has to go through what you did." Emily nodded, her eyes focused on the horizon. "I know. I'm scared. What if they come after us? What if the remnants decide to retaliate?" Sarah placed a comforting hand on Emily's shoulder. "We'll be ready. And we're not alone. Detective Reynolds, the police, they're all working to bring the remnants down. We have people on our side." Emily took a deep breath, letting Sarah's words sink in. "I guess I'm just not used to feeling safe." "You will be," Sarah assured her. "It's going to take time, but we'll get there. One step at a time." The days that followed were filled with preparations. Sarah, Emily, and Detective Reynolds worked closely together, piecing together the information they had on the remnants. Emily provided invaluable insight into the inner workings of the syndicate, identifying key players and safe houses. Ethan, now working with law enforcement, filled in the gaps, giving them a clearer picture of how the remnants operated. But as they delved deeper into the investigation, the danger became more apparent. Strange cars started appearing outside Sarah's apartment, and Emily received anonymous, threatening messages. The remnants weren't going to go down without a fight, and they were making it clear that they wouldn't hesitate to strike back. Still, Sarah refused to be intimidated. For the first time in years, she had hope, a real, tangible hope that they could make a difference. She had her daughter back, and now they were fighting together for justice. A few months later, Sarah and Emily stood outside the courthouse, watching as members of the remnants were led out in handcuffs, their faces grim. It had been a long and grueling process, but thanks to the combined efforts of the police, Ethan's cooperation, and Emily's bravery, the syndicate was finally being brought to justice. Sarah turned to Emily, her heart swelling with pride. "We did it," she said softly. "We finally did it." Emily smiled, though there was a sadness in her eyes. "Yeah, But it's not over, is it? Sarah shook her head. No. There's still a long way to go. But we've made a start. And that's what matters. They stood there for a while, watching as the remnants of the remnants were carted away. It was a bittersweet victory. Justice had been served, but the scars of the past would take time to heal. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Sarah and Emily walked away from the courthouse, their steps in sync. They knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but they would face it together. For the first time in a decade, they were a family again, and that gave them the strength to move forward. Resolution: with Ethan's cooperation and Emily's testimony, the investigation into the remnants moves forward, leading to the eventual arrest of key members of the syndicate. Sarah and Emily, though scarred by their past, begin to rebuild their relationship and look toward a future free from the shadows of the remnants. The case is closed, but the journey toward healing has only just begun. The mother and daughter, now reunited, are determined to face whatever challenges come their way, together. 6 months had passed since the fall of the remnants, and life had finally begun to regain a sense of normalcy for Sarah Williams and her daughter, Emily. The criminal syndicate that had cast a dark shadow over their lives for a decade was dismantled, and many of its key players were now serving long sentences. But the journey to healing was still ongoing, and the scars of the past were not easily forgotten. Sarah stood on the balcony of her apartment, looking out over the city. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the skyline, and for the first time in a long while, she felt a quiet sense of peace. The chaos of the trial and the investigation were behind her, and though the emotional wounds were still raw, she felt like she could finally breathe again. Inside, Emily was at the kitchen table, working on a project for her new job. She had been hesitant to re-enter the world after everything that had happened, but Sarah had encouraged her to take small steps forward. Emily had found work at a non-profit organization that helped victims of trafficking and abuse, people whose lives had been shattered, just like hers. It was difficult work, but it gave her a sense of purpose, something she had desperately needed. Sarah walked inside, watching her daughter for a moment. Emily had changed so much since she had first reappeared in that courtroom. She was still fragile, still struggling with the memories of her time with the remnants, but she was also stronger, more determined than ever to make a difference. "How's it going?" Sarah asked, leaning against the doorframe. Emily looked up and smiled, though it was a small, tired smile. "It's going well. We're putting together a resource guide for survivors. It's a lot of work, but it feels good, you know?" Sarah nodded. "I'm proud of you, Emily. You're doing something that really matters." Emily's smile widened slightly, but there was still a hint of sadness in her eyes. "I just wish it hadn't taken so long for me to figure out where I belong. I wasted so much time, hiding, running away." Sarah crossed the room and sat beside her daughter, placing a comforting hand on her arm. "You did what you had to do to survive. There's no shame in that. And now, you're helping others who've been through the same thing. That's not wasted time. That's finding your way." Emily nodded, though her eyes were still distant, haunted by memories she hadn't yet fully processed. "Sometimes I wonder if I'll ever really be free of it. The remnants, what they did, what I did, it still feels like it's following me, like it's part of me." Sarah squeezed her arm gently. "Healing takes time, but you're not alone in this. We're in it together." Emily looked at her mother, her eyes softening. "I know, Mom. Thank you for not giving up on me. For fighting to find me, even when I wasn't ready to be found." Sarah's eyes welled up with emotion, but she blinked back the tears. "I'll always fight for you, Emily. Always." Later that evening, Sarah and Emily sat on the couch, watching the news. The headline flashed across the screen: "Key members of the remnants sentenced to life in prison." The image of the courtroom appeared briefly on the screen, showing a line of handcuffed men and women being led away. Sarah recognized some of them, the leaders of the remnants, the ones who had orchestrated so many disappearances, including Emily's. Seeing them behind bars should have brought her more satisfaction, but instead, it brought a sense of quiet closure. Justice had been served, but no sentence could undo the damage they had caused. Emily shifted uncomfortably beside her, her eyes fixed on the screen. "It's strange," she said softly. "Seeing them like that. They used to seem so powerful, so untouchable. And now, they're just people, locked up like anyone else." Sarah nodded. "They are people. People who made terrible choices and hurt so many others. But they're not invincible anymore. They won't hurt anyone else." Emily was silent for a moment, then sighed. "I just hope the people they hurt can heal, like we're trying to." "We will," Sarah said firmly. "It might take time, but we will." The next morning, Sarah and Emily made their way to the park, something they had started doing regularly since the trial ended. It was a way for them to reconnect, to find peace in the simple things. They walked side by side, the cool morning air brushing against their faces, and for once, the weight of the past didn't seem so heavy. As they walked, Sarah noticed a group of children playing on the playground, their laughter filling the air. She smiled, thinking about how different her life had been just a year ago. She had been consumed by the mystery of Emily's disappearance, haunted by her failure to find her daughter. But now, Emily was here, walking beside her. The road had been long and painful, but they had found each other again. "You ever think about leaving the city?" Emily asked suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence. Sarah looked at her, surprised. "What do you mean?" Emily shrugged. "I don't know. I just thought, maybe we could start over somewhere new. Somewhere that doesn't have all these memories." Sarah considered it for a moment. The city had been their home for so long, but it was also the place where so much had gone wrong. The idea of leaving, of starting fresh somewhere else, was tempting. "Maybe," Sarah said thoughtfully. "But we don't have to decide that right now. We have time to figure out what's next." Emily smiled. "Yeah. Time. I like that." As the weeks passed, Sarah and Emily continued to rebuild their lives. The scars of the past would never fully fade, but they were learning to live with them, to move forward despite everything that had happened. They had each other, and that was enough. One evening, as they sat together on the couch, Sarah turned to Emily and asked, "Do you think we'll ever feel normal again? Like everything is okay?" Emily thought about it for a moment, then shook her head. "I don't think things will ever be like they were before. But maybe that's okay. Maybe we don't need to go back to the way things were. We can make something new. Something better." Sarah smiled, her heart full of pride for the strong, resilient woman her daughter had become. "Yeah. Something better." They sat together in comfortable silence, the weight of the past slowly lifting as they looked toward the future. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but they were ready to face it together. For the first time in years, Sarah felt a sense of hope, real, tangible hope that they could build a life that wasn't defined by fear or loss. And as they sat there, the world outside seemed just a little bit brighter. Epilogue: 6 months after the fall of the remnants, Sarah and Emily work to rebuild their lives and find peace after years of pain and separation. Though the scars of their past remain, they begin to heal and reconnect, finding strength in their bond as mother and daughter. With the remnants behind bars, they are free to look toward a new future, filled with hope and the promise of better days ahead.